Washington Journal continues.
We're joined now by Congressman Tim Ryan of Ohio. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Want to get your take on what happened last night in the House with Speaker John Boehner pulling his proposal that would have reopened the government, raised the debt ceiling. What's your take?
Well, I think it's following the same storyline, we've been dealing with for, the last 9 or 10 months, since the Tea Party came to Washington, D.C., as you have a very, very small yet big enough group in the House Republican caucus that are controlling the agenda down here. And I think that's what you saw last night. You have all these factions within the Republican conference. You have the extreme folks who still want to talk about defunding the Affordable Care Act or delaying the Affordable Care Act or doing something with the Affordable Care Act to appease the extreme right wing, the Heritage Foundation, and those groups. And you have other more moderate folks like the gentleman from Virginia who was on here before, who I think are honest brokers and willing to sit down and recognize that these fights should happen in regular order. So I think what we saw last night really is just a culmination of what's been happening in Washington really for a few years now, since the 2010 election, but more specifically in the last 8 or 9 months.
And what does this say to you about the character of the Republican caucus and what we can expect to see in future fiscal fights in Washington?
Well, probably more of the same. I mean, and we're allowed to have these fights. I mean, here's the thing. This is what we do. Democracy is a messy, ugly process. We have fights all the time. There's a two-party system in which we engage in these discussions. It's fine. I mean, it is what it is, and that's what we do. But we traditionally do that through regular order. So now we have a House that's Republican, Senate Democrat, President that's just reelected Democrat. So you sit down and you find common ground. You find areas that you can work on: transportation, immigration. What are the issues? And we can have these big budget fights. And the Republicans are gonna get a third to a half of what they want. Democrats will get a third to a half of what they want. We find common ground. We move forward. But this recklessness that's happening now, I think, is really, it's endangering the democracy that we have, and it's clearly shaking the markets, as we saw with Fitch's rating and all of that. I mean, it's starting to affect what's happening in our economy.
Also last night, we saw talks starting again in the Senate between Mitch McConnell, Harry Reid. Does the House have any other option at this point to avert a default other than to accept whatever deal is being able to forge in the Senate today?
Well, I think that's the case. I think Speaker Boehner has got to bring the Senate version that it would be a compromise between Republican and Democrats to the floor. And I will and will continue to urge the Speaker to do that. And I think there is a silent majority within his own conference that if he steps up and says, we've tried to go the Tea Party route, with the obstruction and all of the denying of what can happen if we default, sorry fellas, we got to go in another direction. I think there is a silent majority within his caucus that would support him. And hopefully, if he can take a strong enough stand and bring this to the floor, that we can then have a series of compromise bills on immigration, on transportation, that we can begin to deal with within the political system that the Founding Fathers established for us.
I want to make sure we get your calls. For Republicans, the number is 202-585-3881. For Democrats, the number is 202-585-3882. Or 3880, I'm sorry. And for independents, the number is 202-585-3882.